This is part 2 of Stigma as a Social Problem. In this part of the lecture, what I'll be doing is laying out for you what I call a social cognitive model of mental illness stigma. And it's based on, my experience. My background is as a social psychologist. And I'm building in elements here of what psychologists have learned through decades of research on prejudice and discrimination from a social cognitive point of view. So I'll be laying out that model for you. I mentioned in part 1 that you will probably want to refer to this part of the Stigma as a Social Problem lecture as you do the work that's involved in your film analysis essay project. So in this class, and before I lay out the social cognitive model for you, I want to just remind everyone what we're doing here this semester, and what the whole point of watching movies and taking them apart and interrogating them in terms of the presence of stigmatizing material. We're here to take a look at how writers and directors and actors have chosen to present people with mental illness, and how they've chosen to present people who provide mental health care, psychologists, psychiatrists, social workers, the whole gamut. And I'm reminded that I can't remember which of the streaming services it is, but there's a new series that is just coming out revisiting the Nurse Ratched character from One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. So we're continuing to have examples that we can explore in this course. So we're taking a hard look at these images, the way they're written, the way they're constructed, the way they're performed. We want to look, as I argued in part 1 of this lecture, we have to look at this as a social problem. The fact that we have so many people now incarcerated, and the fact that there's a huge percentage of those people who are incarcerated who have mental illnesses, and the reason that they're incarcerated is because they in fact are ill, as opposed to willfully committing crimes while they're in a healthy state. So we need to think of this as a public health crisis and as a social problem that requires a social solution. We start with the assumption that media isn't the problem. Media exacerbates the problem. So what you have to think about media is a reflection, but it is also a cause. So media reflects what we already believe, what we're comfortable with, and what we expect to see in our entertainment. But simultaneously, it is something that teaches us. I argued in part 1 of this lecture that people report that their major source of education, their major source of knowledge and information about mental illness and its treatment comes from fiction, comes from film and television primarily. As a result, you have lots of people with mistaken information, problematic, negative information frequently that they believe, or even if they don't believe that it's true, it still influences their choices and their behaviors in their social world. So we have to start with this assumption that stigma is made worse, that stigma is exacerbated by these misleading, negative, problematic images that we so frequently see presented to us in the mass media. So we have to ask the question, where does the stigma come from? And it's helpful, at least to me, as a social psychologist, to break apart the process of how we form attitudes and beliefs in general. because I think it contextualizes why it's so difficult to take these attitudes apart, why it's so difficult to challenge and then change these negative beliefs and attitudes about people with mental illness. It's a long-standing understanding within social psychology that the human cognitive system is really constructed around this tendency toward categorization. We appear as a species to be pretty hardwired to organize our world in categories so that it is easier to manage. Imagine if you couldn't put things that you see and hear and smell and taste into boxes, mental boxes. If everything you tasted, everything you smelled, everything you touched, everything you heard and saw was brand new, stunningly new, you would spend a great deal of mental energy trying to just make sense of every brand new experience. So what we do instead, we take the new experience, we store in mind its attributes, whether we liked it, whether we disliked it, if it was a touch experience, its texture, its feel, its temperature, if it was an emotional experience, what was that emotion, what was it like. We store those things in mind. And then when we have another new experience, we kind of automatically, without a lot of thought, we compare it to that old experience. The longer we exist in our lives, the more categories we have and the more refined those categories become, with the ultimate goal being, you can walk through your life pretty sure that you understand what's going on because you can go to these categories and they can help you to make sense of what's out there. We tend to exist in our happiest kinds of states when we, generally speaking, are good predictors of what's going to happen next. We tend to become uncertain, fearful, angry, upset when the world surprises us in disruptive ways. So, everybody, there are pleasant surprises. There are some things we really enjoy having us being surprised by, like the present that you didn't expect, or the phone call from someone that you've been thinking about, hadn't been thinking about, but they've called you nevertheless. We like happy surprises. We don't like disruptive surprises. So we categorize everything because it makes the world more logical, more predictable. Second, we use this categorical information in such a way that it enables us to come up with descriptions of people and groups of people. So we tend to create and use stereotypes as kind of a shorthand for labeling the boxes. So the categories that your cognitive system is made up of, kind of imagine it's your storage space. I know this is a really bad way of describing this, but imagine, bear with me, you have this storage space and there are boxes in the storage space. You need a way of labeling the boxes so you kind of know how to go to them. And by having a little micro description on the exterior of that category, you don't even have to open the box for the category to be useful to you. You just need the stereotype or prototype that's on the exterior of that box. Just like when you move, if you put China on the box, I need to be careful with this box because things could break in it. You also know that you should put it in the kitchen. Or if it's the fine china that you never use, you put it in the dining room. Whatever. Stereotypes, in a way, are the tape that you write on in Sharpie on the outside of that box. Stereotypes tend to be overgeneralized and not frightfully specific. They may be informed by specific experiences that we've had in the past, particularly if they're very memorable experiences. These stereotypes, where they come from, as I just said, they might be very memorable experiences, but most of the time, because they are stereotypes, they are they are prototypical examples. They tend to be incomplete, and they often are vulnerable to the bias of being filled with mistaken information. Now, as we'll see in a few minutes, that's particularly the case for mental illness stereotypes. Fourth, once we've built, so you start with number one, we categorize everything in our social world. Then we use stereotypes to label the categories, and we use those labels, those stereotype descriptions, as a shorthand for visiting that box. Then we have to remind ourselves, where did those stereotype descriptions come from? They come from a very incomplete basis of information. Unfortunately, though, we tend not to question that incompleteness, if we even notice the incompleteness of that source of information. So number three often tends to slide under our level of conscious awareness. We create stereotypes, we create categories, and we populate those categories frequently in a very automatic way. If we've given attention to the information as it's being categorized, we usually do so in a fairly passive manner without really investigating it or interrogating the quality of the information before we categorize it into our boxes. So what happens when we visit these categories? So let's say you're walking through your social world and you see an image or you hear a sound that triggers a particular category. What happens at that point is you will then use the stereotype and then you'll follow the pathway of that stereotype back into your category box to decide, how am I going to perceive this new experience. If it's a person, you encounter the person, maybe they have one or two attributes that suggest they belong in a category box that you have in your mind. Once you have those priming elements, those surface attributes, you're then going to interpret that person's behavior in terms of the category and everything else that defines the stereotype that represents that category. You're going to use that to make attributions, which are causal interpretations of behavior. And you're going to make those attributions in terms of the stereotype. So what you notice and remember about a person you've just seen, if they have certain attributes that suggest to you, that trigger automatic awareness of a stereotype, you will start to perceive in their behavior things that fit the stereotype itself. So that leads us to number 5 here in the stigma process. We have an overwhelming tendency, it's sometimes called a confirmation bias. We have an overwhelming tendency to remember and notice and kind of catalog information that already matches that stereotype description that represents a category that we've filed away in our memory system. We are kind of predisposed to use familiar explanations, familiar stereotyped ways of identifying and explaining to ourselves what we're seeing presently. That confirmation bias kind of fits in with a general pattern in human thinking to prefer the familiar and to use the familiar explanation before trying to find the unfamiliar explanation or to test out the less likely, at least in your mind's eye, possible explanations. So our default position is to, as we're seeing something new, we're experiencing a phenomenon, we look at it, we think about it, and we go to the familiar first. The only time we'll leave the familiar is if we're pushed very hard to switch the type of thinking that we're using. In social psychology, there's this difference between automatic processing and controlled or effortful processing. automatic processing is our default. So we kind of walk through our social world most of the time taking in and cataloging information automatically. It's a very low effort, low cognitive expense way of just fitting into your world. You know, most of the time, you think about driving. If you're driving in a familiar location, you're actually cataloging and paying attention to very little of what's going on around you, because most of that experience of driving, especially in this familiar space, it is familiar. You don't need to pay attention to it. So most of your experience is automatically processed. We do the same thing in our social encounters. If you go back to a pre-pandemic time when we actually got to be in crowds and remember what that was like. And I still have the experience when I'm in the grocery store, because that's pretty much the only large groupings of people that I ever experience these days. You go to the store, you're going up and down the aisles. It's a very routinized experience. The only time you're really critically paying attention is if there's some deviation from what you expect in the normal. So if I asked you after you came home from Walmart or you came home from Giant Eagle, tell me about your experience. At first, you would just start saying, I started in produce and I went through here and I did this. The things that are really going to stand out are the unusual elements, things that really forced you out of your automatic processing and into controlled and effortful processing. So the kind of rule is in human cognitive social processing is that we pay attention to and catalog things that fit with our pre-existing model for how the world works. So that's what gets noticed and remembered. It's also what we pay the closest attention to, which is kind of counterintuitive if you think about it. You would think, if I'm seeing something and it's largely familiar, wouldn't I invest more time trying to think of the ways this is new? Well, in our regular everyday habits of behavior, that's not what we do. We tend to go with what's normal unless we're forced out of that mode by something either really astoundingly different or because we choose to engage intentionally in effortful processing. The next outgrowth, we notice and remember things that are consistent with our stereotypes, with that label that we paste on top of our category boxes. The next step is we tend to have pretty strong associations, emotional reactions that go with our categories, especially human categories. We're categorizing people. Your first categories when you're a tiny baby, you categorize things as familiar and not familiar. And guess how babies tend to react to the not familiar, especially when they get to an age where they start to experience stranger anxiety. Things that aren't familiar, not good. Things that are familiar, good. So we start that way, and for a large part of our lives, most of us, we still tend to go unfamiliar. I'm going to pause and I'm going to think about that harder. Familiar, I'm not going to invest much time because I know exactly what to expect. The unfamiliar, sometimes, for some people, that's exciting. It's interesting. For other people, it's anxiety-provoking. So you can see right away there are emotional correlates to our expectations of other people. If a social group is defined by a stereotype that suggests to you that you should be afraid of them, that you should expect bad behavior from them, that you should expect unpredictability, that you should expect bad things, then your emotions are going to be consistent with that. If the social category of people is connected to the emotional experiences that are positive, you expect people to be good, you expect them to be kind, you expect them to be whatever other positive attributes you come up with, if that's your expectation, it's largely going to be associated with positive emotions like empathy and warmth and happiness, as opposed to negative emotions such as anger, hostility, disgust, and so on. And then finally, notice we've got cognition, emotion, now we have behavior. And I've been pulling heavily in this presentation on Bernard Weiner's theories of attribution. And Weiner, in fact, did a fair amount of research many years ago on stigma related to certain kinds of health conditions like AIDS and HIV. So I'm pulling heavily on this cognition, emotion, action model of attribution. And that's really clear in stages 5, 6, and 7 here of the stigma process. The cognition part, you've categorized and you've labeled. You created stereotypes to represent the category. That then tends to predict what emotional reactions you're most likely to have. The emotion then predisposes you to certain kinds of action. If you have a stereotype that suggests to you that people are likely to treat you badly, and that's your stereotype, or if they present a danger to you, then your emotions are going to be some mixture of fear, anger, disgust, and the like. The action, if you feel fearful, if you feel angry, if you feel disgusted, the behavioral choices are pretty evident. If you're afraid, you move away. If you are angered, you might, embrace that and attack. If you are disgusted, you will show the disgust face and you will move away. So you have cognition, you have emotion, you have action. If you believe that a group is open to you, think about a time you went to a party where you didn't know very many people. You scan the room and you look for any cue of familiarity, of similarity, where you can recognize your tribe somehow. My youngest child is embarking on her college education and is starting at the Columbus College of Art and Design. When we toured the campus, pre-pandemic, obviously, we toured the campus and it was very clear that just walking in the group, they saw people who looked like them. They saw people, even, this is my child who is very fond of dyeing their hair blue. We met the director of the program that they're entering, and her hair was blue. So you look for those cues. You look for something to suggest to you that these are people who you can identify with. Then you're going to then experience relief and some happiness. And what do? So cognition, you find the cues that suggest who these people are. The emotion, if it's positive, you feel positive emotions. What do you do at that party? You go right over there to those people and you start up a conversation. You're not going to start the conversation with people that you look at and you feel have nothing in common with you, right? And that's exactly the process that we're looking at here. So with mental illness stigma, because I've given you the general model, now I'm going to give you the specific. Worst case scenario, what does this look like? Everybody in our culture has a category. So think of that metaphorical storage space that you have. You have a box cognitively in your head that says the mentally ill, or some variant on that label. You have that category, and it's populated by a set of stereotypes, not just one, but probably a set of stereotypes. Most people, based on the research, when the phrase the mentally ill is proposed to them, the first images that tend to come to mind skew in the direction of people with serious mental illnesses, typically mental illnesses that involve psychosis, such as schizophrenia or bipolar disorder. They also tend to skew male, and they also tend to skew in the direction of a prototypical homeless person, of a certain age, kind of like in that middle-aged zone. So if you're talking about what's the prototype for this phrase, the mentally ill, that tends to be what people have as the first image that pops into their minds. And this is likely, predicted by the fact that we see a lot of that prototypical mentally ill person in media representations, where you've got someone who is floridly psychotic, who's intensely ill, tends to skew in the direction of being a male character and being homeless. Sometimes the image is mixed with cues that the person may have a drug habit, may be an alcoholic. It may also include other details, like perhaps a person has a veteran status, for example. But that's a real common version of the prototype, the stereotype description of the mentally ill. So the category definitions, like the research that I presented in the first half of this lecture, this category, the mentally ill, gets defined based on beliefs that you've acquired from your own experience. Now, you should segment out here. There are people who have real lived experience, people who either themselves have a diagnosis or they have a close personal other, a very close friend, a family member who has a diagnosis. Those individuals tend not to have as biased a set of stereotypes about this category than people who do not have lived experience with mental illness. So I'm talking primarily about people who don't have that status of having lived experience. In general, for those people, the category is going to be filled with attitudes and beliefs that are roughly consistent with the most common depictions in the mass media: unpredictability, dangerousness, incompetence, childlike patterns, blameworthiness, untreatability, and contagion. Those tend to be the structure of the stereotype, especially if the prime for that category is this image of the mentally ill that tends to skew in the direction of serious mental illnesses like schizophrenia, or it tends to also include skewing in the direction that is a prototypical male homeless person who also has a drug and alcohol pattern as well. Now, once you have a category and it's defined by stereotyped beliefs and attitudes, we generally, as we're moving through our social world, as I argued before, we generally do not flip the switch away from automatic processing and into controlled processing. So generally speaking, you are not going to, if you see a person, you encounter a person. So for example, several years ago, I dropped into Bob Evans to have lunch with a friend, and in the booth next to us was a man, and I had seen this man around Alliance on many occasions. He was an older man. He could often be seen walking up and down State Street, and he was in the booth next to us, and he was, in many ways, he hit all those notes of the mental illness stereotype. So he had layers of clothing that costume designers often present in their film representations of mental illness. He had not shaved. He was a bit disheveled. He wasn't filthy, but he was a little worn and tired. He smelled like smoke. He smelled like cigarette smoke. He didn't make eye contact with anyone who was present in the restaurant. He was kind of muttering into his coffee as we passed by, and he appeared to be anxious and distressed. You know, we sat down. He was in my eye line, And he very briefly made eye contact with me, and I smiled. And he smiled back a bit. Think about what would you put yourself in that restaurant, seeing that person, and what thoughts might enter into your mind. You see a person who is not sitting with another person, but they're talking. They're muttering into their coffee cup. They have this layers of dirty clothing on, and they appear unkempt and anxious and distressed. Think about, you may go, that's a person who has a mental illness. I don't think I'm going to talk to them. You've made that categorization, and you're probably not going to interrogate it any further than that. So the stereotype then predicts for you, if you have that automatic thought, that's a mentally ill person. And before you know it, you've made some predictions about what that person is likely to do. So if you're like a lot of the people in the restaurant that day, because being the social psychologist that I am, I kind of scanned around the room, and I noticed some people who would look at him, and then they would look at who they were eating with, and they would talk kind of low. They would lean forward and talk kind of low, and then they would look at the man again. And some, you could overhear, the Bob Evans in Alliance isn't very big, you could overhear some people were talking to each other, like, why is he here? Is he going to skip on his bill? Is he going to get upset and hurt people? So one person even asked her server, is your manager going to do anything about that? Didn't say him, said, is your manager going to do anything about that? So the prediction was that this human being who was sitting here in a restaurant, really not bothering anybody, just drinking some coffee, the concern was that he was going to be disruptive, that he was unpleasant to look at, that he was in some way disgusting, and that he really didn't belong in their space. So the stereotypes are what's predicting how this man was expected to behave in that restaurant space. And it kind of predicts the next stages in the process. So what's happening here? People are noticing and remembering people who fit their stereotype. This man, in very many ways, he hit all of the right notes of the mentally ill homeless person stereotype. And that tended to pull then all the notes through automatic processing of that stereotyped category. Once that negative stereotype is activated, as I kind of mentioned a second ago, once that negative stereotype is activated, what people are going to experience is some mixture of negative emotions: fear, anger, pity, disgust. The person in the restaurant who said, is the manager going to do something about that? The choice of the word that, it dehumanizes the person. It's an expression overt of both anger and disgust. That this is a stigmatized person, and this is a person who doesn't deserve to be in a restaurant having coffee like other normal people, right? So once the stereotype is in mind, once it's active and present in your conscious awareness, emotions consistent with that stereotype are going to be activated as well. And then the last step, these emotions can prompt a stigmatizing response. Now, luckily, this was a person in the Bob Evans that was known to the staff. When the woman said, is your manager going to do something about that? The server, who knew this man, and was in fact taking care of his table as well, said, that's just Bob, and I'm not using an actual name, that's just a substitute. That's just Bob. He comes here at least once a week. He's a very kind man. He just has problems. And then she turned and walked away. So luckily for this person, he had defenders. He was known to the staff, and they had his back. So she was able to have some intervening effect, she meaning the server in this case. But what was happening in the mind of the customer who said, is the manager going to do something about that? Those emotions of fear and anger, pity and disgust were prompting the statement to the server, can you get your manager to do something? And the do something was make the homeless man leave because he's disturbing me. Now that's a stigmatizing response. And people who kind of live on the margins, people who are homeless, people who are poor, people who are experiencing psychological challenges, they report very often that they experience these kinds of stigmatizing responses, whether it's in stores, on the street, in public transportation, and in various other environments, that they are treated with those kinds of responses. Now, the whole point of this class is to kind of give you the tools to interrupt this kind of stereotyping process. So the next step is, how can I change this process, this stigma process? That typically, once the train leaves the station, once that category is active, once your stereotypes connected to the category are actively in your mind, it's difficult to interrupt them. And what you have to do as the thinker is you have to go, stop, that's a stereotype. It's in my mind, I have to monitor that, I have to identify that is a stereotype thought. And then you have to dial it back. You have to go back 2 steps and say, what were the triggers that caused the stereotype to arise? Interrogate those triggers, and then consciously look for evidence that counters the stereotype. It's very effortful, at least at first. But once you get in the habit of challenging your stereotypes, it tends to spread and become pretty habitual. So first, my goal for you as students in this class is for you to learn how to redefine a pre-existing category. Now, most students that I've had over the years since I've been teaching this class will tell me in things that they write, in emails that they send me, or in their essays, that when they started this class, they had not really thought about this category, people with mental illness. But once they got started, once they started watching the films and learning how to take them apart, they got some insight that they had, a pretty limited, pretty stereotypical category box in their heads. So my goal for you is to learn to redefine that box, the mentally ill box, with a category redefined with people in the first position. So these are human beings, these are people who have a mental illness. Now, in fact, the man in Bob Evans, he was a person who struggled with schizophrenia. He was, for the most part, at the time when I saw him, according to the server, when I asked her a couple of questions afterwards, because I didn't know him, I had seen him walking, but I didn't know him personally. He was a person with schizophrenia, but he was, a very kind, a very careful person. He preferred to live outdoors. He very doggedly preferred to live outdoors, and therefore, his lifestyle often prompted stereotypical descriptions of him. So once you personalize, once you ask some more questions, so I wanted to know, tell me more about this person, about his life, about his circumstances. And in fact, there were people who knew more. But think about all the times in your life you've never asked that question about a person that you pretty handily, pretty quickly categorized using that mentally ill box. You can take this effortful process one step further. You can open the box and interrogate the stereotype, and then start redefining it. Throw out the inaccurate pieces of information that you used to create the category in the first place, and replace it with new information. For instance, did you know that the overwhelming majority of people with a schizophrenia diagnosis are stable, for the most part symptom managed, or even symptom free, the majority of those individuals have jobs and families. That goes straight up against the stereotype we have for people with schizophrenia. But the research clearly shows that the majority of people in that grouping actually don't match the stereotype that we have for them. So if you're going to challenge this stigma process, you have to open that box, rip the tape off, throw the tape away, dig around in the box, interrogate every one of the beliefs that you have about people in that category. Actually fact check them. So imagine that the category box is full of documents, and your job is to take every document out and fact check it. And then once you fact check it, to actually believe the fact checking, throw out the inaccurate and replace it with the accurate information. This finding of accurate information, as I've been describing it, it does require effortful processing of information. You would have to, rather than just going with your gut when sitting in Bob Evans and saying, you know what, that's a scary person, that's a scary homeless mentally ill person, I want the manager to get them out of here because they're going to hurt me. So rather than going with that gut and interpreting that social situation as a threat, you've now redefined, using accurate information, the overwhelming majority of people, even with disorders that involve psychosis, are nonviolent. And the type of violence that can occur with disorders of that kind is not the kind that typically is going to happen in that environment. So you need to find that accurate information, throw out the inaccurate, replace it with the accurate, and use that in order to engage in social situations. What that often means on the fly is that you actually talk to human beings. If a person represents a category that you have biases against, one of the more difficult ways, at least we think it's difficult, to learn more is to actually speak to people, to take the time to look them in the eyes and to ask questions. Once you've done that kind of heavy lifting of redefining your category, you're going to start to notice all the examples of times when your old category was simply wrong. And you'll notice and remember people with mental illnesses who are successful, who achieve great things, who have productive lives, who have normal lives and normal problems that everybody has. You'll notice that these are people who have families, who have connections, who have friends, who have children. And more often than not, they experience the same ups and downs and trials and tribulations that people who don't have mental illnesses have. Once you begin to notice more and more examples of these people with mental illnesses who are productive, who are adapted, who, despite having these challenges, continue to live their lives, as opposed to being, wantonly violent individuals who there's no possible way for them to be fully functioning members of society. You notice more and more and more of those people who represent the norm. That is the case for people with mental illness. Once that shift takes place, this category is now no longer defined by images, stereotypes, constructs that inspire fear, anger, pity, disgust. Instead, what emotions are triggered by your newly defined category box are things that are more akin to warmth, understanding, empathy, liking, things that would push you and prompt you to approach as opposed to avoid. So empathy and understanding are the key to addressing the social problem of stigma. So I started this whole two-part lecture with the idea that stigma related to mental illness is a social problem. how do we resolve the social problem? One big key part of that resolution is to embrace the fact that people with mental illness are not in fact a breed apart, as Wall entitled one of the chapters of his book. They are in fact just people with particular kinds of challenges. The category, once redefined, tends to prompt these positive emotions. Those positive emotions tend to prompt behaviors that then allow us to engage in support, to engage in advocacy, to engage in lots of different kinds of positive interactions. Not the least important of which is when you have a friend or a family member who is experiencing a mental illness, you can be supportive, you can have their back, and you can encourage them to continue to get the help that they need. Or if they are resistant to doing so, you can be that supportive person who can say, there are things that you can do to feel better, and I'm here to help you do that. So that's the social cognitive model, as I've chosen to call it, for thinking about the stigma process, because it really is a social cognitive process that is challenging to address, but not impossible at all. It does require effort. It requires you to really pay attention to your thinking, to monitor your thoughts and your use of stereotypes, and to intentionally open up those cognitive boxes and dump them out on the floor. Forgive all the imagery metaphors, but I'm a pictorial thinker. You got to dump that stuff out, go through it, and just like when you're cleaning out your closet and getting rid of things that no longer give you joy, you need to get rid of the inaccurate thoughts in your cognitive boxes and replace them with things that are meaningful and smart and right. So that concludes part 2 of Stigma as a Social Problem.